I had lots of this mystery hardwood, and I'm going to use this to make some legs for a couple of drawer units that will later support a large desktop that I made in a previous video. The problem was that all this hardwood has woodworm damage. I'm pretty sure it's no longer active, but I will be treating it just to be on the safe side. One thing's for sure though, with the cost of timber being so high, there's no way I'm letting this wood go to waste. I cut it down to more manageable lengths, which made it easier to pass each piece over the planer to get one face cleaned up. And then I ran that clean, straight face up against the fence to get the edges to 90 degrees. I then ripped each piece roughly in half, and then it was back to the thicknesser to get all of the pieces consistent in size. I've got some woodworm treatment here and I can brush that on, and I waited for it to dry before giving it one last coat. And while I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm going to get started making the carcasses for my drawers. I had some bits of 18mm birch plywood in my rack. After making a few cuts with the track saw, I can then use my panel sled at the table saw to cut each piece to length, and then ripped each piece to its final width. So I'm basically making a four-sided box here, and then I'm making a few marks where I'll be adding some floating tenons. I also labelled each corner A, B, C and D so that I know where they all go back together. I cut the mortises with the domino, and then while I have easy access to the inside of these panels, I give them a good sanding up to 120 grit. Then I can glue in the floating tenons and assemble the boxes. And I'm making two units here, one small one which is this one here, and a large one which I'll show shortly. And once everything is in clamps, I just double check that my corners are square and all looks good. And here's the larger of the two units, all glued up. Then I can sand the outside faces and get all of the edges cleaned up too. Next I can measure up for the back panel for these units, and I had some 6mm birch ply that I can use for those. One of the bits was quite rough, but it'll clean up with some sanding.
Okay, I've got a bit of a problem. So the plan was to use the router with a rebate bit just to run a rebate around the inside back edge of these carcasses. And I started doing that off camera, but I got some really bad tear out. You can see that here. And over here the tear out was even worse, so I've actually glued and clamped that back together. Just to explain why the grain tore out so badly, the grain on the face veneer on this plywood is running in this direction. So as the router bit was spinning this way, it was just chipping out really badly. What I should have done is cut all of the panels so that the grain was running in this direction, and then it wouldn't have been an issue. So cutting a rebate for the back panels to fit into is no longer an option. Therefore, I'm going to flush mount the back panels, meaning ordinarily the edge grain of the plywood would be visible. However, I've got a plan for that. But I'll cover that later in the video when it comes to fitting the legs. So anyway, this mess here is a bit of a shame, but it is the inside of a carcass and there's going to be drawers fitted, so no one's ever going to see this anyway. But I am just going to rub some filler in there and sand it anyway.
I ended up cutting a little splice of plywood just to fill this void. It wasn't really necessary to do this, but it's all good practice. Once the glue had dried, I could plane it down flush, and then I gave it a sanding, and then it was really difficult to spot. Can you see where it is? I'll give you a clue. It starts here and ends here. I'm cutting down the plywood slightly larger than the carcasses by a few millimeters just to make sure that I'll have good coverage. And before we move on, can we all just stop and appreciate how lovely the face veneer of this piece of plywood is? And this is going to be on show once the desk is installed too, so that'll be nice. The other bit I had was not so nice looking, but this one is going up against the wall, so it didn't really matter, but it cleaned up okay with the sander anyway. I get glue added to the back edges and then place the panels on top with some weights until the glue dries. And once dry, I can use a flush trim bit in the router to cut away the excess, and then sanded everything nice and smooth. Now back to the legs, as that woodworm treatment is now dry. I cut each piece to length at the miter saw. And then I took some measurements with my calipers as I want to cut some bridle joints. I divided the measurement by 3 on the calculator and then set the calipers to that measurement so that I can scribe a couple of marks at the end of one of the legs. To cut the joinery, I made a simple jig that will run in the mitre slots of my table saw and allow me to hold the workpiece upright with my hands a safe distance away from the blade. I cut a scrap piece of plywood to act as a spacer, which will help position the workpiece so that the blade will cut on the waste side of the marks. And after setting my blade height to the thickness of the workpiece, I can make a cut to establish the wall of what will be the pin part of the bridle joint. Rotating the workpiece 180 degrees up against the spacer means I'll be able to make a consistent cut to the opposite side. I can then remove the spacer and cut away the rest of the waste. And I did that to both ends of all of what will be the upright leg pieces. I can then use one of those as a template to mark up with a knife where I want to remove the material to form the mating pieces. I cut a new spacer to line up the workpiece so that the blade cuts away the centre portion, and then I can make the cuts and then remove the waste again. When I checked with my calipers, the pin measured 13.7mm and the opening measured 12.39, meaning I was 1.3mm out. So I'd need to remove half that amount, in other words about 0.65mm from my spacer before making another test cut. So I shaved off just a tiny amount at the table saw and then made the cut again. And then the joint came together really nicely, so then I was ready to cut the rest. Then I can clean up all of the joints using a chisel. I can then apply glue to all of the mating surfaces and get all 4 of the leg pieces assembled and in clamps. This is how they look a few hours later once they were out of the clamps, and a bit of sanding cleans them up nicely. I'm going to add a small round over to the legs at the router table. And that's the legs done and ready to install. Now I need to make the drawers. I ordered all of my drawer runners from Amazon. I'll leave a link to these in the description box below. I need to size the width of my drawers to fit inside but also allow 12.5mm for each drawer runner, in other words 25mm in total. I pulled out some scraps of 12mm ply that I picked up from Facebook Marketplace recently, and the face veneer, interestingly, seemed to look very similar to the wood that I used in the legs. A happy accident. I'll use this plywood to make the drawers. First I ripped some pieces to what will be the height of the drawers, and then I cut the pieces to length. Quite conveniently, I happened to come across some off-cut pieces of 9mm MDF at a large DIY store here in the UK. They give stuff like this away for free in exchange for a charity donation, so I shoved a few coins in the box and loaded up my car with 3 bits, which will be perfect for making my drawer bottoms. I always tend to build my drawers in the same way, and this project is no different. First I glue and brad nail all of my 4 sides together, and then I apply glue to the bottom edge and use the drawer bottom nailed in one corner to pull the drawer nice and square to the bottom before adding the rest of the nails. And this makes for really strong drawers without the complications of making drawers in the traditional way. And I get some clamps and weights on until the glue sets, and then repeat. For the first unit, I'm making 2 deep drawers and 1 shallow one for pens and things like that. These drawer runners have a plastic lever inside that you can push to separate the drawer component from the cabinet part. I'm getting the cabinet parts installed first, using a spacer to lift it up off the bottom panel, and then installing the drawer component. Unfortunately though, on first attempt the drawer did not want to go in. So after removing the runner from the drawer, I shaved just a fraction of a millimetre off at the table saw from each side of each drawer, and then secured the runners again. And then they fitted nicely. So I can get them sanded up to 120 grit. And the subsequent drawers got fitted again using spacers, working from the bottom up. On the second drawer unit, my drawers slotted in just fine with no adjustments, although this time I worked with the unit upside down and installed the top two drawers first. And that's because I wanted to leave space at the bottom for a sliding pull-out hanging file rail thing. And I kind of made this up as I went along, so first I glued up this thing here using clamping squares to make sure that it was all square. And these are the hanging files that I have already, and I just needed to figure out how to make some rails for these to slide on. I figured a rail about 8mm in width would work best, as the hanging hook part of these measured about 10mm. So I ripped down a piece of scrap into 8mm strips, then I mark up where the rails would need to be positioned on the pull-out part. And I used the table saw to cut some housings to accommodate the rails. I can then cut the rails to length, and I added a chamfer to the edges at the top. And then I mixed up some epoxy which I'll use to glue the rails in place. After adding a few clamps, I thought I'd better just check that the hanging files would slide okay, and they seemed to slide fine. But later, after the glue had set, I did find that it was a little bit tight in one area, so I made some adjustments with the block plane, and then they slid quite well. Then I can get the hanging file drawer installed.
So I mentioned earlier that I wanted to hide this end grain on the back panel, and the way I'm going to do that is to position these legs flush with the face of that back panel so that it won't be visible. And originally I had planned to position the legs like this, flush with the face of the top panel, but now I'm thinking that I might lift the legs up just to give me a bit of a shelf where I can put things like notepads and things like that.
In the end, I decided to leave a bit of a reveal at the back so that the legs protrude by a few millimeters. I just thought that looked nicer, especially with the roundovers on the legs. And I clamped on a temporary spacer to the top of the legs to help me position each leg consistently. I can then mark up where the mating surfaces will be so that I know where to apply glue. And I'm not using any screws or nails here, just clamps until the glue dries, as there's so much gluing surface here that it'll be plenty strong enough. I'm going to need some drawer fronts, and I had a few bits of sapele measuring about 15mm thick. I ran these through the thicknesser to clean them up, and look at how beautiful the grain on my drawer fronts is going to be. I was so chuffed with these. I can cut them down to length and plane the edges clean. And for the deeper drawers, I needed to laminate some of the pieces together. I added a roundover just to the front edges of the drawer fronts before giving them a good sanding, and they were ready to install. But before I do that, I'm going to pull out some strips of wood to make some lipping to add to the front edges of the carcasses to hide the plywood edge grain. After ripping the pieces to the thickness I wanted, I cut miters and did lots of careful measuring, marking and cutting to add trim to all of the front edges, gluing each piece in place and holding them in place with masking tape and a few clamps. And when the glue is set on the trim pieces, I do the final sanding to clean everything up. And then to install the drawer fronts, I'm using a combination of wood glue for strength and hot glue for temporary hold to fix them in place. And again, a couple of thin spacers help just to get my spacings consistent between drawers. Once the hot glue is holding, I can secure with some screws from the inside. For finish, I'm going to be using water-based varnish, undiluted, straight from the can, but through a paint filter to keep out any bits. And it was so exciting to see the grain on the sapele come to life. I was so pleased with how these units were looking. Everything got denibbed with 400 grit in between coats to keep everything smooth, and I gave it 3 coats in total.
So that's 2 drawer units built for the base of the desk, and I'm still debating what to do about supporting the corner of the desk, but I'll cover that in the next video when it comes to installing it. And there are lots of other changes that I want to make to the office room too, so I'll wrap all of that up into the third part of the video, I think. Also, I've ordered the drawer handles online, but I haven't yet received them, so I'll install those in the next video too. I'd love to be able to tell you how long this project has taken so far, but I've completely lost track. I've been working on it on and off now for almost 3 weeks. That's for the desktops and the base. But because I've been working on other things as well, I've kind of just lost all track of how long it's taken. I'm really excited about installing it though and seeing how it all looks together. Anyway, please subscribe to my channel for more weekly woodworking videos. If you'd like to help support the channel plus get early access to my videos, some exclusive videos like the ones on screen now, free project plans and cut lists, and a name credit at the end of my videos, you can find links to my YouTube channel membership and Patreon page in the description box below. Thank you for watching.